What if I told you that some of the most legendary names in American firearms aren't truly American anymore? Sounds hard to believe, doesn't it? But behind the patriotic branding and red, white, and blue marketing, a quiet shift is taking place. Factories are being sold, operations are relocating, and foreign investors are gradually taking ownership of brands that many of us grew up trusting. I've spent a lot of time going through public records, import-export data, and congressional transcripts to figure out how this is happening and why. For some companies, it's a matter of staying afloat. For others, it's about chasing profits. But one thing is clear, the more you uncover, the more alarming it gets. This isn't just about jobs heading offshore, this is about American control over the very core of our ammunition and firearms industry slipping away. Stick with me, because what I'm about to walk you through impacts every shooter in this country more than you might realize. Let's begin with the case that's gotten the most buzz in the gun community, Vista Outdoor. Now, maybe you haven't heard that name tossed around much, but I guarantee you know the brands they own. Federal Premium, Remington Ammunition, CCI, and Speer, some of the biggest names in American-made ammo. Well, Vista just sold off all of them. In a deal valued at over $2 billion, Vista spun off its entire ammunition arm, now renamed the Kinetic Group, to a Czech defense company called the Czechoslovak Group, or CSG. On the surface, it looks like a typical business transaction, but in reality, this move hands over a massive portion of our civilian ammunition production and a crucial share of our primer supply to a foreign corporation. Why did Vista pull the trigger on this deal? The official explanation is all about boosting shareholder profits. But when you dig deeper, it becomes clear that it's also about streamlining their operations, outsourcing logistics, and sidestepping some of the regulatory and labor challenges here at home. The backlash came quickly. Lawmakers, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and the National Sheriff's Association all raised red flags. They say this is more than a business decision, it's a national security threat. After all, we're talking about one of the few industries critical to both civilian freedom and military readiness. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States did launch a security review, and the sale was approved. But critics argue the review was rushed and overlooked the long-term dangers. As of now, roughly 3,800 American jobs are still intact, at least on paper. But here's the problem. All the decision-making power, strategic planning, and profit direction now flows through Prague, not Minnesota. And here's the part that ought to keep every serious gun owner awake at night if there's ever a major conflict or disruption. Do we really want our ammo supply chain under foreign management? This goes way beyond business. It's a warning shot. Now let's turn to a name that practically defines American gun culture, Smith & Wesson. You'd be hard-pressed to find a firearms owner who hasn't handled one of their revolvers or semi-autos. And yes, these guns are still put together in the United States. But here's what most folks don't realize: a growing portion of their internal parts aren't made here anymore. Over the last few years, Smith & Wesson has quietly started sourcing key components like barrels, triggers, springs, and even safety parts from overseas suppliers, especially from countries in Asia and Eastern Europe. And this isn't just a handful of niche parts. Entire assemblies, including critical mechanical internals, are now being manufactured outside the United States. Why the shift? It mostly comes down to economics. After years of trade instability, domestic supply chains struggled to keep up with surging costs and a shortage of skilled labor. To remain competitive, Smith & Wesson, like many other manufacturers, started turning to foreign sources that could offer lower costs and quicker turnaround times. Here's the problem. When Americans see "Made in the USA" stamped on the slide or frame, they assume the entire firearm was crafted from raw steel to final shot right here at home. But in truth, many of these guns are only assembled and tested in the US, with the guts shipped in from halfway across the globe. From a shooter's perspective, performance might still be top-notch, but from a national security lens, this paints a troubling picture. Imagine a scenario where the global supply chain grinds to a halt just like we saw during the pandemic. If critical components are coming from overseas, our firearm industry becomes just as fragile as the electronics or pharmaceutical sectors. And the kicker? Most of this outsourcing is never disclosed. It's not on the spec sheet, not mentioned in the ads, and certainly not part of the company's brand image. So, what does this tell us about where American gun manufacturing is headed? Smith & Wesson is a clear example of a broader trend. We're entering an era where guns still look American but are increasingly built with foreign parts underneath the surface. When someone asks, "Are American gun companies going overseas?" the real answer isn't always about moving entire plants. Sometimes it's a quiet transformation, happening one imported trigger at a time. Ruger has long branded itself as a no-nonsense, all-American firearms maker, tough, reliable, and proudly built on U.S. soil. But if you scratch beneath the surface, the picture isn't quite as red, white, and blue as it appears. While it's true that the majority of Ruger's firearms are still assembled and test-fired right here in the United States, a growing portion of their parts, things like polymer frames, optic mounts, and specialty machining components, are now being sourced from overseas suppliers. These changes didn't come with any big announcements. Instead, they crept in quietly, buried in supply contracts and international logistics arrangements that rarely draw public attention. So why the shift? As Ruger broadened its lineup to meet rising global demand, outsourcing non-critical parts became a cost-saving necessity. U.S. suppliers just couldn't keep up either in precision manufacturing or pricing, especially as global competition intensified. That opened the door for offshore sourcing. The result is what you might call a blended production strategy. Final assembly still happens in America, partly to maintain branding, partly for quality control, but many of the materials and components are already well-traveled by the time they reach the workbench. It's a smart strategy from a business standpoint, but it raises questions for those of us who value American manufacturing in more than just name. What makes Ruger's situation stand out is how effectively the company has preserved its Made in America image. There's no press release detailing the changes, no interviews about shifting suppliers, just a quiet, behind-the-scenes evolution. To most buyers, it doesn't feel like a betrayal. The guns still shoot straight. The fit and finish are solid, and the reliability hasn't skipped a beat. But for those of us who care about manufacturing sovereignty, this trend mirrors what's happening across countless other American industries. The core production ecosystem, the small shops, skilled workers, local tool makers, get stripped away in favor of global efficiency. Ruger hasn't packed up and left the country, but part of its supply chain certainly has. Now let's talk about Glock, a brand that dominates the American handgun market. From everyday concealed carriers to beat cops to military operators, Glock pistols are everywhere in the United States. But for all its popularity, Glock has never been a fully American company, and that's a detail a lot of people miss. Founded in Austria, Glock set up shop in Smyrna, Georgia, to better serve the growing North American market. The move was smart. Having a domestic operation helped the company avoid import taxes, sped up distribution, and made them eligible for certain government and law enforcement contracts that require U.S.-based production. But even with that Georgia facility, The majority of Glock's real manufacturing muscle still sits in Europe. Core components like the slides, barrels, and internal assemblies are made overseas, then shipped to the US for final fitment. What happens in Georgia is more akin to assembly and finishing than full-blown manufacturing. That means Glock can legally stamp assembled in the USA on its guns, even though the soul of the weapon, the metallurgy, machining, and engineering comes from across the pond. From a legal and logistical standpoint, it all checks out. And the truth is, most gun owners don't mind or don't know. Sales are still through the roof. But when you really think about it, this setup makes the concept of buying American a whole lot more complicated. A pistol with a US serial number may have traveled thousands of miles in crates of parts before landing in a gun safe or on a duty belt. And here's the real concern. While Glock's US facility is substantial, it's still tightly linked to Europe. If something were to disrupt operations overseas, whether it's a trade war, political conflict, or export restrictions, the supply chain could seize up fast. That would hit the American side of the business hard and immediately. At the end of the day, Glock is a global firearm with an American accent. It's still one of the most reliable handguns on the market. No question about that. But for folks who care about keeping firearms production truly domestic, it's a reminder that what's written on the box isn't always the whole story. Taurus has always had a somewhat murky place in the world of American gunmaking. Although the company was born in Brazil, it poured serious resources into the U.S. market, including building out a manufacturing site in Miami, Florida, and later relocating to Bainbridge, Georgia. For a while, it looked like Taurus was putting down real roots in American soil, but that momentum didn't stick. Over the last several years, more and more of the company's production has quietly shifted back to Brazil. In fact, several models that are aggressively marketed to American buyers are now believed to be built almost entirely overseas. What's left here in the States is a streamlined operation, some light assembly work, product testing, warehousing, and corporate offices. But let's not kid ourselves. The heavy lifting now happens outside U.S. borders. This isn't just about trimming fat. It's about sidestepping America's steep labor costs, environmental regulations, and ever-present legal risks. Brazil offers the company a more relaxed environment to operate in lower wages, fewer regulatory hoops to jump through, and closer access to emerging markets in South America and Africa. Sure, they still advertise under the banner of Taurus USA, but the American manufacturing presence has shrunk dramatically. And that change didn't just hurt the brand's image, it left a real dent in places like Bainbridge, where Taurus had been hailed as an economic shot in the arm. Hopes of long-term job creation vanished, and plans for revitalizing the area were scaled back or shelved entirely. From the buyer's perspective, the shift hasn't driven up prices or caused any major supply issues. Taurus handguns remain among the most budget-friendly in the market. But those low prices come at a cost, namely, offshore labor and international shipping logistics. Today, Taurus operates more like a multinational firm than a true American firearms manufacturer. And that shift didn't make front-page news. It happened quietly, behind closed doors, as branding and economics were carefully balanced. The company still talks like it's speaking to American shooters. The manufacturing side, not so much. Now let's turn to Sig Sauer, one of the fastest rising stars in the American gun world. Whether you're talking about elite law enforcement teams, military contracts, or civilian carry permits, Sig has carved out a reputation for cutting-edge design, surgical accuracy, and rugged reliability. They even landed the U.S. Army's new sidearm contract with the Modular Handgun System program. On the surface, SIG looks like the gold standard of American firearms manufacturing. And to be fair, SIG Sauer USA runs an impressive campus in Newington, New Hampshire. That's where they assemble firearms, develop advanced optics, and even operate their own training academy. But peel back the branding, and you'll see something important. The company's leadership, funding, and global direction are rooted overseas. The parent firm, L&O Holding, is based out of Germany and Switzerland, and it's there that much of the high-level research, development, and executive decision-making takes place. In other words, while SIG Sauer USA is building guns here at home, it answers to a boardroom across the Atlantic. Some models that hit the American market are first developed or even partially manufactured in Europe before being finalized in the States. This isn't about losing jobs, SIG has created plenty here, but rather about who ultimately calls the shots. And in a world where geopolitics can change overnight, that foreign oversight could become a real vulnerability. If Europe ever tightens export controls, or if diplomatic tensions flare up, SIGs, American operations could find themselves scrambling to adapt. That's a risk worth paying attention to, especially when national defense contracts, law enforcement supply chains, and civilian market demands are all on the line. What makes it even more complex is that SIG has done just about everything right from a business angle. They've grown American jobs, invested heavily in infrastructure, and earned the trust of countless shooters. But when you zoom out, one thing is crystal clear: no matter how red, white, and blue the marketing may be, the company's future isn't fully in American hands. And that brings us to the bigger picture. What we're watching isn't just a trend, it's a shift in how America defines industrial control. The gun industry is simply the latest battlefield. We've seen the warning signs: factory closures, quiet offshore deals, supply chains winding through foreign ports. What once felt proudly American is now shaped by international priorities, cost optimization, and boardroom strategies that don't always align with national interest. This isn't just economics, it's about sovereignty. It's about small towns that lose out when jobs vanish. It's about what happens when critical industries, like ammunition and firearms, are no longer anchored in the country that needs them most. Some of these changes crept in slowly. Others were buried in fine print or masked with smart branding. But taken together, the message is clear. American gun culture is increasingly built on foreign-owned infrastructure. And if that gives you pause, it should. So before you buy your next firearm, ask yourself this: would you still pull the trigger on that purchase if you knew the design was German, the parts were Chinese, and all we did here was snap it together and stamp it assembled in the USA? If this conversation matters to you, and I think it does, don't let it end here. Share this video. Drop a comment. Let folks know this is something worth thinking about. Thanks for watching. Stay sharp, stay skeptical, and I'll catch you in the next one.